All right. Good morning, good afternoon. I guess good morning for 4 more minutes for folks that are on the East Coast. We're so happy to have you here on a Friday, whether it's 80 degrees or 40 degrees. We're glad you're here with the WSP team to have a great discussion. We're just going to wait a couple more minutes for folks to join. Pull up a seat. Hope you have a hot beverage and a pencil. Again, you're welcome to join whether you're wearing shorts or fleece pants or formal slacks. This is, as a reminder, this is a WSP-hosted information session about the Greenhouse Gas Protocol's request for information. This is a second in the series, and we're excited to offer more. This one is regarding actions and market instruments, the phase 1 of this particular working group. Great. And we'll wait a couple more minutes for folks to join. If you're wondering exactly what this is, it's called a power bolo. You might not know. You thought that this was going to be a fashion webinar, I'm sure. Instead, you're here to watch something about the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. I got one smile from Julie, so I know that we're from our speakers, so I know that we're on the right track. All right. And as a reminder for folks that are joining, there will not be a pop quiz today. Don't worry. All right, we've got some folks joining. We're so happy to have you.
We could consider a pop quiz at the end, Ramona.
It's true. Yeah, we can do an audience participation. You can vote if you'd like to have a pop quiz. That's our only polling question. Will this help you if you pretend like you're a student and you're having a pop quiz? We're going to wait just a couple more minutes. All right. Welcome, everyone. Okay. I think we are going to jump in here and get started. We hope that on this Friday, maybe you have a warm bowl of oatmeal, maybe you have some lunch, an iced tea, a hot coffee. We are so glad you're here with us today. This is an information session hosted by the WSP team regarding the Greenhouse Gas Protocol request for information, specifically about this Actions and Market Instruments Working Group request for information, phase 1. Next slide, please, Bridget. So some important logistics as we get into this session. First, we're discussing some key concepts. This is the opinions of the WSP team. We're trying to sort through and wade through this very long white paper and help explain these concepts to you. We don't represent the greenhouse gas protocol in this capacity. This is also part of an ongoing request for information, and so you'll have a chance to respond to the greenhouse gas protocol. We hope that this is informative for you as you think about your response. We are using this Microsoft Town Hall technology to manage this session, and you'll only be able to listen in, but you can participate in the Q&A, and we really hope that you put in your toughest, most thought-provoking questions in the Q&A. We'll pause a couple of times and answer questions, so please poke holes, ask questions, think big here. We will be sending a recording and summary notes out after the session. If you were forwarded this invitation a little bit later, then please let us know and make sure you're on that follow-up communication. You can send me a note or any of your WSP contacts, and we'll make sure you're on our list. As you're asking questions, if you wish to remain anonymous, please just check the little Remain Anonymous button when you're submitting your Q&A. And if you don't, that's okay too. Again, please ask us questions. We would also love feedback as you're going through this presentation and you say, if you have thoughts on what was helpful, what wasn't helpful, what you want to know more of, please, again, send us a quick note, jot down a comment to your WSP colleagues. Next slide, please. So today we are joined by some of our preeminent greenhouse gas and reporting experts. And you might not tell from their serious demeanor, but they are so excited to present this information. And we've got a couple of folks on hand in the chat box also answering questions that you might not see on video. The folks you'll see speaking to us today are Ryan, who's a greenhouse gas and reporting expert. He's been working in this space for more than 15 years, and he teaches at Columbia University for the past 5 about this very topic. Julie brings 2 decades of experience in climate and energy leadership, working in public, private, and nonprofit. And she really values not just helping clients think in big ways, but also practical ways, and setting goals, but then also doing the hard work to achieve them. So not just one, but both of those specific things. Seth leads our greenhouse gas accounting practice and has been working in inventories for over a decade. My name is Ramona Cohen, and I lead our training domain. Worked in the sustainability industry for 15 years and with a focus on stakeholder management, change management, and adult education. Next slide, please. Today, we're going to be covering some important concepts. Can you go back one, please? We got so excited about the objectives. Thank you. Again, some really big concepts, some new, some things you're maybe already familiar with that are being asked in this request for information. We think that this particular webinar is going to be relevant to you if you're interested or potentially curious about market-based mechanisms. So this, if you're wondering again, what does that term mean? This can include low carbon fuel certificates for sustainable aviation fuel, SAF, or renewable natural gas, or low carbon material certificates for use in Scope 1 and Scope 3 reporting, as well as greenhouse gas accounting options for insetting and value chain decarbonization activities. And again, if you're a little unfamiliar, we'll be talking more about what these mechanisms are today. We've done our best to clearly explain these concepts and make this content feel accessible, but it's a lot. So if you're a person who needs to see something and hear it a couple of times before it really sinks in, know again that we're going to send out the recording and all of the notes, including our great questions that we received today, so you can see it again. We will be covering today key dates, logistics of the current request for information process, introduction to the variety of reporting statement formats in the current white paper, and then some next steps and what support is available from WSP. with that, I'm going to hand it off to my colleague Seth here to jump into some of the logistics. Thank you, Seth.
Yeah, thanks, Ramona, for that intro. So I'm going to be giving a brief intro here, setting the context for this request for information and teeing up the content to come. Next slide. So the context here behind this is really that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has not been updated in a significant way for over a decade. Um, and there have been new ideas advanced about measuring actions in that space. And what we're reviewing today is the start of the greenhouse gas response to decide what will be the next standard going forward. This is part of the evolution of the greenhouse gas protocol. We'll get into a little more of that later. But essentially, since the last greenhouse gas protocol update, many companies have taken actions to influence emissions within and beyond their value chains in ways that aren't reflected in their corporate physical GHG inventories. For example, companies may invest in emissions reduction or removal projects within their value chain, but the project impacts may not be directly traced or allocated to the company's own inventory data. And companies have been exploring the use of new market instruments such as commodity certificates or carbon credits or investments beyond the company's value chain, efforts to avoid emissions, among others. There's a whole host of activities that are being covered under this umbrella of actions and market instruments. But these instruments, other than, as we know, Scope 2 RECs, can't be counted in a greenhouse gas inventory under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol in its current form. And to fill that gap, some other organizations and consortiums of companies have created frameworks in the absence of greenhouse gas protocol guidance on these actions and instruments. To fill this gap and flesh out how these actions and instruments might be credibly incorporated into inventories. And some companies have even used, there's different terms for this. One of them is like a management criteria where a company defines their own criteria for how they're counting actions and market instruments outside of the protocol. And they will dual report. So they'll report according to the protocol and then report according to their own criteria. And that criteria may not ultimately align with the greenhouse gas protocol as it evolves. So there's been a lot of action, for lack of a better word, in the market to respond to this gap in the current protocol. And this Actions and Markets Instruments Technical Working Group has been formed to address this gap and introduce what is going to be a new standard to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and we'll be reviewing phase 1 of their work today. Next slide. So how this fits into the context of the broader Greenhouse Gas Protocol. This evolution is on these 4 standards: the corporate standard, which is being revised, the Scope 2 standard, which there was already a public consultation over their phase 1. The Scope 3 standard is also being revised, and then this new Actions and Market Instruments standard is a brand new one. There's also other standards that are not being revised, like the Land Sector and Removals standard, which just came out. That is not being revised. That is brand new. These are the ones that are being revised in this process. And another piece, little tidbit, is that the consequential electricity subgroup that spun off from the Scope 2 Standard Technical Working Group is the content of that is being covered now by the Actions and Market Instruments standard, and we'll get into why that is and where that sort of consequential electricity fits into the proposed framework for actions and market instruments. Next slide. And just to reiterate, this is a process that began way back in 2022 with the release of the global survey. And the work in phase 1 of the Action Market Instruments Technical Working Group has been going on since late 2024. This white paper summarizes their progress to date, and phase one is focused on the general structure for potentially reporting actions and market instruments. After this public consultation, the technical working group will go into phase two, which will address the implementation details and thorny questions of how this is all going to work. And after that, there'll be another consultation period on more concrete draft guidance, where those thorny questions will be answered and proposed before the final standard is released in 2028. So we're a few years out from having something in hand that is the standard. And just to reiterate, the content of this webinar and this white paper is just phase one. And you can see here, phase one is really establishing the general structure for statements that are being proposed to be introduced under this actions and market instruments framework. And it is very high level. And the details, the thorny questions, if you've had your mind into this for any length of time and are trying to figure out what this if you are an organization that's been a little bit ahead of this, you're probably thinking about those details. Those details are not being addressed here. Phase one is high level, it's general, and the questions in the RFI are also very high level. And for some of you, it may feel like they're so high level that they're not worth your time. Like if you are here to find out if actions and market instruments will be able to be counted toward your physical inventory or another greenhouse gas target, I'm sorry, we can't answer that question. You may be tempted to tune out until phase two when those questions will be answered. But here's the but, stick around. We know that across our clients and the people on this call, we represent some of the biggest and most influential companies in the world. And as such, I think it's really important that we participate in giving feedback early on in this process, because these phase one fundamentals will give structure to all the details that are to come. So with that in mind, stay tuned for what the structure of the proposed report is.
Thank you, Seth. So assuming that not everyone took Seth's invitation to drop off at this point, we are going to get in to the content right now. What is in this RFI? So Seth, thank you for the context. I think that's important. And yeah, we're still in an early phase here, but things have come together enough for us to be able to at least get a picture of where they're thinking of going. And I think it is a good time to weigh in with the group on this call, your opinions on how you would like to see this evolve further. So yeah, let's go to the next slide. This is the whole proposal. This is, in a nutshell, what is on the table. So the idea here is really building on the scope 2 market-based approach, right, which is a dual reporting approach. We're seeing market-based just based on geography, and we're seeing scope 2 emissions based on market, right? And so it's the idea is it's complementary. We see it from this angle, we see it from this angle. We're building on that approach here. So we're going to keep the physical greenhouse gas inventory that we all know. We're going to expand the market-based inventory. So it's not just going to be scope 2 electricity anymore. It's going to be also scope 1, scope 3 potentially. Exactly what will be in there, we'll get into a bit further in a few more slides. There's another statement that is meant to complement those first two, which is an impact statement. This is totally different, and it's looking at what is the result, what are the impacts of actions that we've taken that may or may not be reflected in some way in the physical inventory, but there's more to the story, and we want to be able to disclose it. So there is the proposal here for a different statement. We'll get into what that might look like. And then there's a fourth statement, and that is the non-greenhouse gas indicators. And so this is completely different. This is kind of unlike anything else that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has done before. These are not denominated in emissions or avoided emissions. These are other indicators. So we'll get into what that might look like in a minute. So let's go to the next slide, please. All right, so just to go a little bit into how these statements are different, three new statements. We have three different accounting approaches that are being used for these. So the first new statement, market-based, as I mentioned, it builds on the existing market-based approach. It is still taking some activity data, so number of kilowatt hours, for example, multiplying it by an emission factor. And that emission factor can come from a purchase, right? A contracted volume of renewable electricity that has an emission factor of 0. So you have activity times emission factor of 0 equals emissions, can be 0 for, some of these things. And what we're talking about here is not such a big change, right? It's still attributional or inventory accounting. Activity data times emission factor equals emissions. The next one is different, right? The impact statement is using consequential accounting. Sometimes this is called project accounting. And this is different because we're not multiplying units of activity times an emission factor at all. We're saying what would have happened if we didn't do something, right? So if we didn't do this, emissions would have been X. We took an action and emissions were Y. And so the emissions that were avoided are X minus Y. So there's this subtraction element, and we're very dependent on defining the counterfactual, what would have happened, that baseline, without our actions, right? That's how we get to what the impact is. So this is new. It brings new challenges. It's a different kind of accounting. And then we've got the third new statement. This is just indicators. A little bit unclear still what form this will take, but the idea is there is a dedicated and somewhat standardized place to disclose indicators that are not denominated in terms of emissions, but they're aligned in some way with a transition to a low carbon future. Maybe they're leading indicators. They're helping show that we're making progress towards something that hasn't yet shown up in our inventory or in these other statements. So that is kind of the quick summary of what is being proposed here. Let me just pause for a second and see if there are any questions we should address before we move on to more details.
Thanks,
Ramona,
Ryan.
anything new?
Yes, we got one in the chat here so far, and a couple more streaming in. So please feel free to add questions as you think of them. We're going to go obviously into the nitty-gritty details after this, but even high-level questions are helpful at this point. So first question here is just in terms of our team, how do we stay informed on this ongoing evolution of the greenhouse gas protocol standards? Is there a recommended resource for our valued partners, client partners here who are on this call?
Yeah, great question. The greenhouse gas protocol has been very transparent in posting materials from the working groups on their website, and so you can follow every month or so. There are meetings of the technical working groups, the 4 different groups that Seth identified, and so you can really follow it play by play if you have that level of interest. There are more occasional asks for comments. So this RFI and occasionally a full public consultation And those are where there'll be a more full kind of proposal of some sort of what this might look like, or this RFI. So I think there are kind of those two tiers of how closely you can follow this. You can also ask us, and we can give you a more tailored answer.
Julie or Seth, anything to add?
No, agree with all of that, and definitely looking at that website frequently is a great way to stay informed. Just also, as most people who are on this call know, because they've probably been involved in this space for many years, it's a pretty close community of people. Most of us have been working on this for the better part of a couple decades, so there's just also a lot of relationships and sort of cross-pollination of information and idea sharing that, you know, helps us to stay up to date and able to guide our clients.
Thanks. Another question that just came in, which I feel very strongly, I'm tracking a lot of other information, but this seems very complicated. Will all of these reports be required for all companies?
No. So at this point, these are being proposed as, hey, we think these might have value. Do you all think that they have value? Should we create these? So that's the point where we are in the process. If they get overwhelming feedback that, yeah, we think these could be valuable, maybe we'd like to see this safeguard in place, or, you know, we'd like this, but not this, right? Some of these may actually not be created in the final standard, or will be maybe narrower than what's currently envisioned. But the idea of, is something required? We're not close to that decision. That would be, if once this exists, then there will be a decision. Is it so valuable that it really should be required? I think that's a ways down the road.
Thank you. And then last question, then we can move on to the next section here. How will scope 2 consequential methodology, how will the scope 2 consequential methodology proposal be integrated into this framework?
Yeah, so it will be considered, is how they framed it in the RFI. It will likely find its way into the impact statement, and it will be probably, you know, that guidance will result in a view of what scope 2 consequential impact will look like, how it would be calculated. But we're still, it's not clear exactly, you know, will it be in the form that was proposed, you know, a few months back, or will it evolve?
Nice. Thank you. We're going to move on for now, but we just got another great question, and so we'll begin with that one in our next Q&A section. Thank you so much.
Great. So we're just going kind of one level deeper into these different statements and, you know, considerations for them. Physical inventory statement is not actually changing. It's not part of this working group's remit. So there are some changes that are being proposed there by other technical working groups and as part of the larger process. Here, this group is leaving the physical inventory alone. So we can keep going to the next one. All right. So yeah, let's just talk a little bit about what is being proposed for the market-based inventory. So this is meant to be complementary to the physical inventory. Similarly to have the scope 2 market-based is complementary to the scope 2 location-based. It is using the same activity data, right? The number of megawatt hours, the number of gallons, the number of, you know, whatever activity data you have in your physical inventory, that is consistent. So it's a common activity pool, but you have other emission factors to apply. You have access now to basically purchased emission factors. So whereas the market that was previously kind of accessible was just for electricity, and it's, you know, RECs, power purchase agreements, utility specific green tariffs, that was what you could apply, can apply now in the market-based approach. The proposal here is, what about allowing access to emissions factors from renewable natural gas or SAF, right, sustainable aviation fuel, or other types of certificates where there is a market and you can get access to a certain volume, you match that with your activity data, now you can use that emission factor in your reporting. So that could potentially really bring a lot of more options to scope 1 as well as scope 3. Scope 3 would be all those different fuels, also metals, chemicals, low carbon cement, etc. A lot of these are kind of listed in the RFI as potential, as examples of the types of contractual agreements and low carbon commodities that could be included here. Very importantly, the eligibility criteria for what can count and the safeguards and the quality criteria for, what bar is in place for us to be able to report it, those are going to be defined in phase 2. So we are at a point where you can weigh in on, yes, I support this and I would like to see this be part of this, but those specific examples of here's the list for scope 1, we don't have that just yet. So let's go just one more slide on the market-based side of things. The primary question that's being asked in the RFI related to this is, do you support a market-based statement? So, it's a question that, should we support it? Do we think this is a good idea? It kind of follows this debate about the market-based accounting for scope 2. There are many people who believe it has enabled more capacity, more renewable energy capacity to be built out faster than it would have by incentivizing corporate action. There are some who think maybe some of that's happened, but also there's been a lot of really cheap recs that have been kind of an easy button that maybe haven't been so impactful, and they've enabled people to kind of say, all right, we've done our job and not done as much in other ways. That same debate is going to play out here. Ultimately, do we think expanding on the market-based idea, we're going to accelerate growth of new markets for low carbon fuels and materials? Are we going to give those things a kickstart and really build bigger markets for those by enabling companies to count these things in their inventories? If so, then you would be likely a supporter of this. If you're skeptical, if you're thinking about the challenges that may come with this, potential double claiming, double counting, because we have to define residual factors, right? If somebody's getting access to this low carbon, basically emission factor, then there's somebody else who's maybe using something that doesn't get that factor, right? And to ensure that they're not using an average that also incorporates that low carbon element, we need processes in place to ensure that they're getting a residual factor. This has been a challenge for scope 2. It's going to be a challenge for scopes 1 and 3 as well. So there are some challenges that will need to be overcome in phase 2, but potentially big opportunity. So if there are questions on this, we'll get to them in the Q&A. Let me for now pass you over to Julie, who's going to talk through what is being considered for the impact statement.
Thanks, Ryan. All right, everybody. Thanks for hanging in there with us. We know this is a lot of content, and kind of settle and get comfy because we're going to go a little bit deeper on this slide because this is where a lot of the sort of meat of the new material is. So this third statement is the GHG impact statement. This offers kind of a different view on emissions reducing activities, and it serves as it's kind of a dedicated place for reporting on the emissions impact of actions that could be taken inside or outside of a company's value chain. So these could be emissions reduced, removed, or avoided. And it's also the first place that we see consequential accounting show up, which assesses the impact of an action, as Ryan was describing, against a counterfactual. So looking at the difference between what the emissions would have been without the action versus with it. And the GHG impact statement would ensure that these claims that are using consequential accounting versus attributional are reported really transparently and separately from statements that use the attributional accounting, but would still give you a place to disclose and talk about them. So, why does this matter? Why do we need this? Previously, these types of emissions impact didn't really have a standardized kind of sanctioned home. There wasn't a statement that was dedicated to capturing them. They didn't fit in the physical inventory. They couldn't be calculated with attributional accounting and placed in a contractual inventory. But, they're arguably worth reporting. They are resulting in real emissions reductions. And I think there was a feeling that we needed an official statement that was governed by some kind of set criteria to recognize these types of investments and climate accomplishments. So it doesn't necessarily mean that any of the components of our original theory of change have changed. So still think that a reporting entity should engage its suppliers, should change its buying practices, should optimize its own operations. That all still stands, but we all know that the world we live in today is, a little different than when these rules were established many years ago. We thought we were going to be making more progress faster than we are, and we're seeing that, we're hitting some walls, and we're recognizing that we need more emissions reducing activities, and there's corporate appetite and ambition for investing in those more broadly and extending beyond one's own supply chain and operations. So I think GHGP has heard you in your call that, hey, we're willing to do this, but we're not going to hit our goals if we don't have a little more flexibility in what we can disclose as meaningful climate action. So to motivate those types of activities, if they're not permitted in a physical inventory or contractual inventory, we need some place to validate and disclose those and receive some credit. And that's what this impact statement affords. So within that graphic that you see there, the GHGP has proposed some further segmentation within this statement. So this is where it gets kind of layered and a little bit complicated. So we thought we might try to bring this to life with a few examples. You can find this graphic on page 23 of the RFI, and then we've added some examples to talk through. So first, starting with projects that are thought of as being sort of closest to the reporting company, and we'll move towards ones that are further away from the reporting company. But starting with closest, these are projects with emissions impacts within the reporting company's organizational boundary. So this might be, for example, an on-site renewable energy project on one of the company's own facilities. So they have operational control, and the resulting emissions factor, let's say it's a solar installation and it's 0 emissions per megawatt hour, that's lower than the grid average. And this is already reflected in their inventory, right? Because they're able to have a lower emissions factor for the consumed energy because of this blend. But the proposed approach here is showing kind of a different angle on that same investment. So it's asking, what would the emissions have been if the on-site solar installation hadn't happened? So maybe this project is in a region that has a relatively dirty grid, so there's tons of avoided emissions because it's a big solar installation, it covers the whole facility, it's running at the right times of day, they're able to pull a lot of electricity from it and not use grid electricity in those times. So that's great. You might be thinking, this brings up a question of, whether this same impact is kind of reported twice, because they already got the benefit of the reduced emissions factor in their consumed electricity. And now they're saying that we also avoided having consumed this electricity. Well, that's part of the reason for segmenting those benefits in recording them in two places. But it does start to get a little bit sticky, and that is part of what I'm sure you're all hoping comes out in the phase 2 guidance to sort of provide some clarification and some distinction there that avoids things like double counting, but still provides the flexibility to kind of give credit where credit is due. So that's the first one. Moving on to the next one, impact of sold products. So this is sort of that handprint concept that you might be familiar with. If you sell something that has a lower emissions profile than the standard product on the market, so for example, you make electric vehicles, you build high performing buildings that are very energy efficient, you make wind turbines, you could disclose the consequential reduction in emissions in this statement. So you're saying, yeah, my company's emissions are growing. That's what's going to say in the physical inventory because more people are buying my climate friendly product. But that's not a bad thing because they bought my product, their emissions went down. This is what I enabled for the atmosphere. I enabled a reduction in emissions versus what would have occurred had they not bought my product. And again, we could sit here all day and talk about but the what if, because there's a lot of it brings a lot of questions to mind. But this is a concept that has been sort of actively in discussion for a while, and I think it's exciting to see it sort of recognized as having a kind of a segmented, specific home in this version. All right, third one, moving a step further away from the company to value chain associated impacts, with the value chain, of course, encompassing entities and activities upstream and downstream from the reporting company. So here you don't have direct operational control. Maybe you have kind of a loose relationship at best. Maybe this is like a tier 3 or tier 4 supplier pretty deep in your supply chain. And let's say you fund an energy efficiency project on their site and they're not allocating you any, excuse me, preferential emissions reductions, because if they were, that'd be captured somewhere else. Assuming that hasn't happened, but you want to capture this benefit somewhere, this is where you would be able to reflect that. And then moving one step further out. So now we're not investing in projects in our own value chain, but we're investing in projects within sectors that are relevant to our business. So now we're in sector associated impacts. So let's say, for example, you use a lot of semiconductors or cement or steel, and you invest collectively with some other buyers who also use those products in a project that really drives down emissions at multiple manufacturers' site for one of those things. You could reflect your share of that enabled reduction here. You'll probably notice that throughout this statement, we're talking a lot about enabled reductions. This is an emissions reduction that I didn't necessarily affect by my own behaviors, but I did in a way enable it to happen within somebody else's organizational boundary because of something that I did. And then moving as far as possible out from the company, the global impact. So this enables you to reflect projects that are good for the atmosphere, credibly reducing emissions, but there's not a tie to your value chain or necessarily even the sectors in which you operate. So you make and manufacture and sell yoga pants in the United States, and that's what you're all about, US yoga pants. And then you invest in an afforestation project in Malaysia. So different industry, different market, different region, different type of input and material. Great project for the atmosphere, but not related to your company. So that would go here in global impacts. And then there's still a fair amount of details to, work out here, as I alluded to. So the quality criteria, what sectors are aligned enough with yours to claim. A lot of those issues are being sort of punted to phase 2 of the process. They're intentionally and very sort of overtly excluded from this version of the white paper. But as my colleagues were saying earlier, we think it's still, there's still an opportunity to bring that up in your response if you want to. So moving on to, it's kind of considerations for the impact statement. If you are inclined to put together a response, we hope you will. We're not advocating for any particular position, but just trying to kind of stir up ideas and thoughts that might help you form your own opinion. You might really like this concept of the impact statement if you feel like we need to accelerate investment in a broader set of interventions, and we need to be a little more flexible in how we do that. If you think that this is going to enable that to happen, you might want to, mention that, support that. Maybe you've been frustrated by the inability to report some really cool, important projects and some things you feel are really moving the market, and you want to get some recognition for that. This is a place to report that. On the flip side, if you're concerned that this feels like another layer of reporting, this dilutes the message I'm trying to give to investors or companies or regulators. If you feel like this is too much, it adds too much, it's not germane to my actual environmental performance and the emissions that I operationally sort of induce, then maybe this isn't for you. So again, I don't think you need to put yourself in one box or another, but these are just some things to consider and some nuance you might want to build in. And then the next one is a little simpler because it's a little less developed, but moving on to the non-GHG indicator statement. This one, GHGP was very clear in the white paper saying this one kind of got the least attention in the development process. And in phase 2, we'll consider like, do we really need this? And would we be able to build sufficient boundaries and guidelines to make this credible? Because this is when you have an intervention that cannot be quantified in terms of the carbon dioxide equivalent, the CO2e benefit, you could put it here. So could put a lot of things here. Presumably there will be some guidelines and quality criteria that would say sort of what threshold you needed to clear. But some examples here might be, you're buying renewable energy, but you're reflecting it as there's a percentage of renewable energy that was consumed or $1 that we spent, but you don't have a CO2e equivalent or CO2 equivalent. Maybe you are buying or selling a certain percentage of your inputs that have a certain low carbon content or meet a certain label requirement. Maybe you reflect that here. Maybe some of these things are kind of leading indicators. They're not really at a state that's mature enough to reflect as with a CO2 equivalent. But this maybe gives you a place to kind of start introducing these as you then kind of move them up the hierarchy of these various statements we're talking about. I'm moving to the next slide, the considerations for this statement that you might want to just kind of mull over as you're forming your own opinion. This one gives you a lot of flexibility, and we have kind of intentionally steered away from talking about how this will layer up into goals and specifically like counting progress towards science-based targets. GHGP has been very clear, like that's SBTI's thing. We're talking about the accounting rules. They're talking with each other. These are sort of parallel tracks, the development of these things, but also very sort of co-informed. So there's a lot of collaboration going on. We think that's really positive, but we're not able to say like specifically how these things will tie together. I will just say here that if you're following the developments of SBTI's net zero standard, you may be familiar with the volume or counterparty alignment concept, where you say a percentage of our goods or a percentage of our suppliers are meeting these criteria. And this would give you a place to also disclose that. Because it's not CO2e equivalent, but it's just a different type of KPI. And then again, you feel like this is too much, this leaves too many questions unanswered, you don't think they could be effectively resolved. I don't know, that's a kind of pessimistic approach. I think we can resolve these things. We're just in an early phase, but that's a reason that you might be more skeptical. And then moving on to my last slide, and then I will hand it back over to my colleagues. We're hoping that this helped to get your wheels turning. Like, now we've made it through all the statements, that part's done. And we hope that this gives you some ideas for ways that you might want to respond. We're thinking about this stuff like all day, every day. Kind of embarrassing, but true. And we care very deeply about the integrity of carbon accounting and the rules and all of that. But we also want to see a world in which climate-friendly capital and projects are really unleashed at a scale that the atmosphere needs and notices. So we look forward to working with you as we think about how to contemplate these rules and how to craft climate action and ambition in a way that is respectful and of the rules, but not constrained or hamstrung too much by them. So we look forward to finding that path forward with you. And now I'll turn it over to Seth to talk a little bit more about the tactical next steps of the RFI response.
Yeah, thank you, Julie. That was great. Yeah, so next steps, there's not a whole lot here to go over, but a little bit on the RFI itself. This one is, if you participated in the Scope 2 one, the Scope 2 public consultation, you may be intimidated. This one is much shorter. It's like 10 times as short. There are about 20 questions. There's 15 questions about you and then 20 questions about what you think. So much, much shorter, much more easy to manage. And you have 60 days from March 31st. So the RFI period closes May 31st. And again, these questions are high level, and essentially these are it. Do you support the multi-statement approach? Do you support market-based? And then there's free text fields. There's like your level of support and then a free text field to explain, for you to justify and provide caveats. Do you support an impact statement? All the categories, should they be merged? One thing we didn't get to in the impact statement is, should negative impacts, so emissions increases, be reflected here in the impact statement? If we're talking about positive impacts, do we also need to be talking about negative impacts? There's a specific question on that. And then, do you support the non-GHG metrics? And again, all of these have some, Likert scale ratings and free text fields for you to say and provide justification. And the justification is really where you can get into, yes, I support, but with these caveats, and allude to some of the details that are forthcoming and how those details might shape your opinion on whether or not you think that these statements are a good thing. And then next slide. So again, the public RFI is open until May 31st. You consider if you want to submit a response. If you do and you feel like you need some help thinking through some of these things, you can connect with your WSP contact for support with organizing a response. Again, after this consultation period, there will be a phase 2 where these sort of thorny questions get addressed by the technical working group. There will be another public consultation on their proposal considering the phase 2 progress around this time next year. So look for another webinar like this one where we will be diving deep into a lot of the meaty details. And again, final guidance is not anticipated for another 2-ish years. So it'll be a little while till we actually have a standard in hand. And I think we have some time for questions now.
That's correct. We've got all of our speakers back up here. Grill them. Please feel free to drop in more additional questions. We're going to be going through some of the ones we've already received. All right, so we're going to begin with this one. With the current limitations and guidance, how do you suggest companies account for decarbonization efforts in Scope 3 or Scope 1? Do you recommend this management criteria approach despite SBTI and GHGP advising against it? Julie, do you want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I guess one that I feel like I can't really answer without knowing the, sort of the specific situation and kind of risk appetite, things like that of the person or the company that's asking. So it's certainly an option, writing management criteria, approaching things in a sort of bespoke way out ahead a little bit of some of this evolving guidance. And that's something that we're very happy to talk about and kind of figure out if that's right for you. But it is a very sort of company specific approach that comes with its own sort of risks and opportunities. So it's kind of like more of a conversation required to land on a firm answer. But it's an option. Definitely, it's a viable option.
Seth or Ryan,
And if you're
anything to add?
considering that, you should consider responding, because now's a chance for you to insert your opinion into what that criteria might look like, right? Going into phase two.
Nice. All right. We've got one thinking it might be a good one for you, Ryan. Is there likely to be guidance on the extent to which the physical attribute and the associated market-based instruments can be used in scope 1? For example, if natural gas is a common natural gas pipeline plus associated RTCs can be counted in scope 1.
Yeah, I would say yes, very likely there will be guidance addressing that specifically. This is an eligibility question, so applying a market-based approach to these types of certificates in scope 1, there'll be an answer either yes or no, and if yes, under these circumstances, what are the quality criteria? But I definitely expect a clear answer on that.
Nice. All right, another one, Seth. Is it clear yet if market-based instruments can be included in the SBTI target boundary and baseline for scope 1 and 3 as it is for scope 2? It seems right now that if they're reported outside the physical inventory, they won't count towards a net zero goal.
Yeah, so as many things, it is not clear yet. There's very little that's clear yet. One thing that the white paper states explicitly is that the GHGP is not, Greenhouse Gas Protocol is not involved in rule setting for target standards, right? That is SBTI's role to write the rules on what is allowed to be included under their frameworks. That said, GHG Protocol and SBTI are working together to align on the next evolution for both the accounting standard and the target, but that is currently unclear, and it will ultimately be up to SBTI whether or not these new statements will be eligible for inclusion in net zero goals or other goal structures that they introduce.
Ryan or Julie, anything to add?
I would just say I know it's a little unsatisfying not to have more clarity around that, but I think that's a great place to insert your feedback and position in the RFI response, and just state very clearly what you hope will be allowed and what the benefit of that you feel would be to corporate climate action.
Nice. All right, last question, unless we receive any more here. What is the future of using purchased RECs to reduce market-based emissions? Will updates include real-time matching and same grid requirements? Who wants to jump in?
Scope 2 question.
This is Final Jeopardy. Just kidding. There's no wrong answers.
In short, we addressed this a little bit during the Scope 2 consultation. We recorded that webinar, and yeah, that was covered. That will be covered under the Scope 2 technical working group, not this one. And yeah, so it is to be determined by a different technical working group.
But we can send the recording out for that one if you missed the first one, our first info webinar. Great. I think we've answered all of our questions. Anything else to add? We're so grateful.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your time today. And for those who are watching the recording after the fact also, who maybe had fun weekend plans, congratulations. We are around to support and answer questions and help you prepare guidance or help you prepare a response should you want that. Thank you to all of our speakers and to our team also who's behind the scenes helping to support this work. And we appreciate your time. Friday.
Thank
We
you.
need a
Thank you.
Thanks for
Friday
joining,
theme
everyone.
song here to go out with a theme song. Thank you, clients.
Thanks, Romana.
All right.